1940, May 10th. The crisis did not arrive as a sudden explosion, but as a creeping rot of dread. For years, the US Army had been content to design weapons based on what infantrymen could carry. They were not focused on what German tanks could actually stop. That complacency, rooted deeply in the isolationist spirit of the 1930s, meant that when the Panzers rolled through France in 1940, the American arsenal was already obsolete. The fall of France shattered the illusion of distance. The demand for dedicated anti-tank capability suddenly became an existential scream. This forced ordnance engineers into a desperate, shamefaced scramble. They needed thousands of guns immediately. But the design and production timelines for the 37mm M3 were simply too slow. The solution was a humiliating expedient. They would resurrect the dead. Deep within the arsenals lay stacks of the venerable French 75mm M1897 gun, a relic of the First World War. These field guns were never intended for the high-velocity, flat-trajectory work of tank killing, but they were available. Engineers began crudely mating the old gun tubes with hastily fabricated low-slung carriages. The smell of machining oil and decades-old cosmoline filled the shops as men worked around the clock. They were trying to retrofit a weapon designed for horses and shrapnel into something that could face modern steel. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, 918 of these converted 75mm guns had been rushed into service. It was a stopgap measure that spoke volumes about the Army's technological lag. The 37mm M3 gun, meanwhile, was finally rolling off the assembly line in quantity. Production goals were set ambitiously high, yet its operational life expectancy was already measured in months, not years. The first hard lessons arrived not in Europe, but in the jungles of the Philippines. They arrived later, on the sun-baked plains of North Africa during Operation Torch in late 1942. Sergeant Frank Riley, a gun commander in the 1st Armored Division, felt the dry, searing wind on his face as his crew wrestled the 37mm M3 into a firing position near an olive grove. The crew had been trained using optimistic charts showing the gun's ability to penetrate 40mm of armor at 500 yards. They had been told this weapon would stop any medium tank the Germans could field, but the charts lied. The German tank, a Panzer IV Ausf F2, appeared over the slight rise, its long 75mm gun menacingly still. Riley's crew worked with mechanical precision, born of endless training, snapping the first armor-piercing round into the breech. Gunner, traverse right. Target, center mass. Riley shouted, his voice cracking against the desert quiet at the 37mm Spitfire. The muzzle flash instantly kicked up a dense, choking cloud of red dust directly in front of the position. It completely blinded the gunner to the trajectory of the shell. This was a known design flaw, one that made rapid follow-up shots impossible. Riley heard the clang. It was not the satisfying hollow sound of penetration, but a sharp, high-pitched ping. It was the sound of steel striking steel and deflecting. The Panzer continued its slow, inexorable advance. Load another, aim lower, try the track, Riley screamed, swatting the dust from his eyes. The second round hit the front glacis plate, close to the driver's vision port. Again, there was the loud, sickening ping. Travelling too slow and lacking the mass to overcome the slope and thickness of the German armour, the projectile simply skipped off, as one officer would later report. It was like throwing marbles. The crew stared, frozen by the sudden, terrifying realization that their primary weapon was an expensive noisemaker. The German tank, now realizing the source of the annoyance, calmly traversed its main gun. The resulting blast of high-explosive shrapnel tore through the olive grove, silencing the US position instantly. This was the brutal, repeated reality faced by American troops across North Africa. The 37mm M3 was worse than useless. It was a psychological trap. It gave the men the illusion of defense, only to fail them at the moment of truth. At the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the reports were unequivocal. US troops had lost confidence in the weapon. 2 general officers branded it useless as an anti-tank gun. The only way to guarantee a kill was to possess the guts to stand and shoot from 100 yards, a suicidal proposition that few survived. The debacle at Kasserine Pass was the final bloody indictment of a decade of strategic failure. It forced the US Army to finally abandon the myth of the lightweight, man-portable anti-tank gun. They had to embrace the necessity of weight and power. The command structure moved with uncharacteristic speed, establishing the Tank Destroyer Center to focus the effort. Most critically, they authorized the immediate production of the 57mm gun, the American version of the proven British 6-pounder. The US Army was finally, desperately, attempting to catch up to a war that had been raging for nearly 4 years. The cost of their early complacency was now measured in the lives of the gun crews who had been sacrificed to the bouncing marbles of the 37mm. The blood spilled at Kasserine Pass was the final non-negotiable invoice for years of institutional denial. The 37mm gun was dead. Its replacement, the 57mm, was already a proven design, the British 6-pounder. But its adoption by the US Army was less a moment of triumph than a grudging compromise. It was fraught with its own set of debilitating problems. The US version featured a slightly longer barrel for increased muzzle velocity, a necessary boost for a gun that was already playing catch-up. Production began with urgency. But the logistics of war proved far less nimble than the engineers' blueprints. When the 57mm guns finally began reaching forward units in the spring of 1943, they arrived naked. Sergeant First Class Dale Kincaid, a gun chief in the 3rd Infantry Division, felt the dry, hot air of Sicily on his skin as his company unloaded their new toys. The 57mm looked imposing compared to the tiny 37mm. It was a real weapon, with a thick, serious barrel and broad trails. As Kincaid inspected the crates of ammunition, a cold dread settled in his gut. They had armor-piercing rounds. "Where's the HE, Lieutenant?" Kincaid asked. Gesturing at the stacks of steel-tipped shot, Lieutenant Davies ran a hand across his sweaty brow. "Ordnance says it's coming, Sergeant." Priority was given to AP. "We have to be able to stop tanks first." Kincaid swore softly. "Sir, we spend 90% of our time fighting infantry and bunkers, not tanks. What am I supposed to do? Challenge a machine gun nest to a duel with a solid steel slug?" The reality was crippling. The 57mm, intended to serve as a versatile piece of field artillery capable of supporting the infantry, was neutered by the lack of essential ammunition. The ideal mix, 85% armor-piercing, 10% high-explosive and 5% canister for close-in infantry defense, was a pipe dream. Kincaid's men spent weeks scrounging, trading cigarettes and rations with adjacent British units just to acquire a handful of high-explosive shells. That was the only thing that could effectively clear a roadblock or suppress a mortar position. The gun was powerful, but tactically blind, reduced to a single-purpose weapon in a multifaceted fight. The Sicily campaign in July 1943 offered a brutal proving ground. The 37mm guns still present were predictably useless, bouncing off the few heavier German tanks encountered. They did, however, manage to knock out some of the lighter, older Renault tanks of the Italian forces, and the presence of the Tiger tank, even in small numbers, confirmed the new baseline of threat. The 57mm was a step up, but the army was already struggling to find a balance between mobility and power. This struggle was complicated by the ongoing, vicious bureaucratic war back home. That conflict raged between the Army ground forces, led by the steadfastly pro-Toad General Leslie McNair, and the aggressive newly formed Tank Destroyer Command. McNair believed Toad guns were essential for infantry support. Conversely, the tank destroyers were convinced that specialized, armored, self-propelled vehicles like the M10 were the only viable answer to the German Blitz. The resulting doctrinal tug-of-war effectively crippled development for months. A simultaneous effort to create an even heavier Toad gun led to the 3-inch M5. This was a pragmatic Frankenstein's monster, mating an anti-aircraft tube with the carriage of a howitzer. That the 3-inch was powerful. It was capable of penetrating almost anything the Germans fielded at the time, but it was enormous. In late 1943, when the 3-inch guns finally lumbered into position in Italy, the complaints were immediate and universal. They were too large, too heavy, and fundamentally incompatible with the close, broken terrain of the peninsula. The infantry saw them as anchors. One afternoon near the Volturno River, Sergeant Kincaid watched the futile effort to deploy a 3-inch gun that had been assigned to support his regiment. The gun, weighing over 2 tons, was hitched to a truck that immediately bogged down in a muddy track. The crew dismounted, straining to push the massive trails. The gun chief shouted, his face purple with exertion. "Come on, you bastards! Pull!" The gun barely shifted. The track was too narrow, the mud too deep for any human effort. Then came the crack of a German 88mm shell landing 100 yards away. Shrapnel whistled through the trees. The crew instantly abandoned the trails and dove into a ditch. They were pinned down, unable to maneuver the weapon, unable even to fire. Kincaid watched the scene unfold with grim understanding. The theoretical advantage of a towed gun, its ability to be manhandled into a position where a vehicle couldn't go, was a complete lie. Once a towed gun was under fire, its crew's first instinct was survival, not heroic exertion. Commanders quickly reported that the 3-inch was too heavy and sluggish. It was clumsy to deploy, large and difficult to conceal. The 57mm, while lighter, still forced crews into impossible situations.
The danger was not just being shot at, but the necessity of moving the weapon while being shot at.
It was the winter of 1944. Kincaid, now fighting in the mountains above Casino, was ordered to move his 57mm position forward 50 yards before dawn to cover a crucial ridgeline. The move required traversing a low, open stretch of ground before reaching the cover of a ruined farmhouse. The temperature was freezing, the ground was hard. Kincaid and his 4 men wrestled the 57mm forward, pulling on the newly designed trail handles. The steel wheels crunched sickeningly on the frozen earth, every muscle in their body screamed with the effort. A German machine gun, hidden high on the slope, opened fire, a sudden ripping sound tearing through the pre-dawn quiet. Tracer rounds sliced the air around them. "Drop it, hit the dirt," Kincaid yelled immediately. They flattened themselves against the cold ground. The gun, abandoned mid-move, sat exposed, a tempting target. Kincaid felt the sharp sting of ice and grit against his cheek. They were pinned. They couldn't move the gun, and they certainly couldn't fire it. The theoretical mobility of the towed weapon vanished instantly under the pressure of small arms fire. They waited for 15 agonizing minutes. The machine gun finally stopped, likely reloading or shifting position. Kincaid risked a look. The gun was 50 feet away, inert and useless. "We go now." 1 man on each trail. "Pull fast," he whispered, his breath clouding the air. They sprinted back to the gun, grabbed the cold steel and hauled. The gun's shield, which offered a purely psychological comfort, felt like tissue paper against a heavy caliber round. Kincaid knew that if the machine gun opened up again, they were dead. There was no engine to provide speed, no armor to provide protection. As only raw muscle and stark terror. They finally dragged the 57mm into the relative safety of the stone wall, collapsing behind it, chests heaving. The sheer physical vulnerability of the towed gun position, the necessity of exposing yourself to set up, move, and fire, was a psychological burden that no amount of ammunition or training could offset. The adoption of the 57mm was a necessary evolutionary step, but it solved only one problem: penetration, while exacerbating others, namely logistics and survivability. As the campaigns ground on toward the dense hedgerows of Normandy, the US Army was still fighting the war with towed guns that demanded suicide bravery. They were hampered by a lack of proper shells and constantly outmaneuvered by the very terrain they were supposed to defend. They had replaced the marble thrower with a cannon, but they had forgotten to give the gunners a fighting chance to live long enough to pull the lanyard. The dense, claustrophobic hedgerows of Normandy in the summer of 1944 delivered the next agonizing lesson. The American commitment to towed anti-tank weaponry was not merely a matter of inadequate caliber, it was a fundamental misjudgment of the battlefield itself. The 57mm gun, rushed into service to replace the despised 37mm, immediately proved tactically crippled by the bocage.
This ancient landscape of high earthen banks and thick hedges turned every field into a fortified maze.
This restricted the traverse of the gun and prevented crews from dragging the heavy trails into an effective firing position. The theoretical ability to manhandle the weapon was completely erased by the practical reality of exhaustion, mud, and continuous German observation. Worse still, the US High Command had fundamentally miscalculated the enemy. They had assessed the Panther as a rare, heavy tank and aberration. Instead, it was rapidly replacing the Panzer IV as the standard German medium tank. The shock was immediate and brutal. The 57mm, and even the larger, more cumbersome 3-inch gun, lacked the muzzle velocity and penetration required to defeat the Panthers' sloped frontal armor. Commanders watched their rounds. Even the precious few British high-velocity shells they managed to scrounge strike the thick glacis plate of the Panther and simply shatter. The German tank was impervious at typical engagement ranges. Major General Mantonedi, commanding the 9th Infantry Division, watched the towed guns struggle and deemed the 57mm virtually useless in the close country encountered. He often relegated them to the thankless role of accompanying artillery, firing high-explosive rounds at infantry targets, a job they were poorly suited for due to the chronic lack of HE ammunition. The failures in Normandy were merely prologue for the catastrophe of the Ardennes. In December 1944, as the German Waffen am Rhein offensive ripped open the American lines, the inherent vulnerability of the towed anti-tank battalions was exposed in the most terrifying manner. Operating independently, without the protection of entrenched infantry, these units were caught in the open, overwhelmed. When the smoke cleared, analysis showed towed anti-tank battalions had suffered a devastating 3-to-1 loss ratio against tanks. They were, as one post-war history would bluntly state, tank fodder. The deep, slushy mud and frozen ground of the Belgian forests provided the final definitive indictment. Lieutenant Colonel McKinley, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 9th Infantry Regiment, had spent days desperately defending the critical, crinkled Rocherath crossroads against the full fury of the German armoured thrust. His troops were exhausted, freezing, and running low on everything. After the fighting subsided, McKinley sat down with an observer, the memory of his losses raw and stinging. He didn't mince words. Lieutenant Colonel McKinley didn't mince words. The 57mm guns have no place in the infantry battalion, he stated, his voice tight with controlled fury. You can't put them where you need them. He described the futile struggle to deploy the weapons in the chaos of the Ardennes. The mud, deep and clinging, had rendered the guns' already limited mobility zero. The guns could not be moved on the roads available to me due to deep mud, he explained. The crews operated without the protection of armor or engine power. They were immediately subject to direct enemy observation and fire. They were slow, fixed targets. McKinley's frustration was echoed by his men, whose confidence had been utterly destroyed by the experience. During the crisis, the 57mm gunners suffered a devastating 26% strength loss in the First Army's towed units. The larger, heavier 3-inch towed battalions fared even worse, suffering a 35% loss. Though the 3-inch gun was powerful, it proved simply too heavy and sluggish. You can't get them up to the front, commanders complained. This lack of tactical mobility was a fatal flaw when orders always demanded pushing forward to support frontline infantry. The crisis atmosphere peaked in mid-December as the German offensive approached vital supply depots around Malmedy and Spa. The designated anti-tank guns had failed utterly or were simply too slow to deploy. In a moment of pure desperate improvisation, the First Army authorized anti-aircraft section commanders to lower their massive 90mm M1 anti-aircraft guns. They repurposed these behemoths as emergency anti-tank roadblocks. Near Spa, Sergeant Ed Vance, an anti-aircraft gun commander, felt the cold metallic bite of the massive breech. Then his crew wrestled the gun into a hastily dug position beside a frozen road. This weapon was designed to track fast-moving aircraft high in the sky, firing proximity-fused shrapnel charges. Now they were chambering armor-piercing rounds for ground targets. Vance had never trained for this kind of combat. The 90mm was an enormous weapon with an imposing long barrel. Its carriage, however, was utterly unsuited for ground warfare, offering almost no protection and requiring immense effort to traverse and elevate for a flat trajectory. They waited in the frigid air, the silence broken only by the occasional distant rumble of artillery. Then came the sound of heavy diesel engines growing louder, closer. A column of German half-tracks and 2 Panzer IVs moved confidently down the road, believing the way was clear. Vance's officer gave the order, fire for effect, center mass. The 90mm roared, a sound far deeper and more concussive than the 57mm. The massive high-velocity shell struck the lead Panzer IV. There was no ping, no deflection, only a bright, violent flash of white-hot steel and explosion. The tank turret was visibly shifted on its ring, and smoke immediately poured from the seams. The results were devastatingly effective. The 90mm, a weapon never intended for the role, proved successful due to its sheer mass and velocity. There, The necessity of using anti-aircraft guns to plug the gaps left by the Army's designated anti-tank weapons was a stinging public admission of doctrinal failure. The combat data from the Ardennes provided the final irrefutable proof. Self-propelled tank destroyers, the M10 and M18, were found to be 5 to 6 times more effective than their towed counterparts. The M10 achieved a favorable exchange ratio of 1 to 1.9 without infantry support. This ratio climbed to a staggering 1 to 6 when working alongside foot soldiers. Towed 3-inch guns, by contrast, were successful in only 2 out of 9 defensive actions. The conclusions drawn from the field were unanimous and damning. At a tank destroyer conference in Florence in November 1944, commanders declared towed battalions unsatisfactory and grossly inferior to SP guns. The psychological toll proved to be the ultimate heartbreaking factor. Men cannot and will not stay with towed guns as they will with the M10 or M18. The war had simply outpaced the towed gun, leaving behind a legacy of immense struggle and wasted valor. By May 1946, the Stilwell Board, charged with charting the future of the U.S. Army, issued its final unequivocal recommendation. There should be no further development of towed anti-tank guns. The towed anti-tank gun was officially obsolete, relegated to history by the brave gunners who had proven that courage alone could not defeat steel. The future of anti-tank warfare lay in mobility, armor, and the rocket, a hard-won lesson, bought with the lives lost in the mud and snow of Europe. The war in Europe was over, but the lessons were still bleeding. In the quiet, sterile environment of post-war Washington and Aberdeen, the focus shifted from battlefield survival to cold analysis. The question was no longer how to stop a tank, but why the designated tools had failed so spectacularly. Yet, even as the 57mm gun crews were being massacred in the Ardennes, the institutional momentum of the Ordnance Corps continued its slow, inexorable roll. If the 3-inch gun was too small, then surely a bigger gun, a behemoth, would succeed. The final, desperate attempts to save the towed anti-tank concept manifested as enormous experimental weapons like the 90mm T8 and the 105mm T13. These were monsters of steel, complicated, heavy beyond the point of practical use. They were designed to solve a problem that the battlefield had already proven was non-existent. In the cavernous testing bays, engineers wrestled with the T8, a 90mm gun tube mated to a carriage so structurally complex, the T5E2, that it was considered unsound. They were trying to achieve the muzzle velocity necessary to defeat a Panther's frontal armor, but the resulting weapon was an anchor. It was impossible to conceal, impossible to maneuver, and required a massive crew and a heavy prime mover simply to exist. The T13, an unconventional lighter 105mm design, was an attempt to regain portability. Still, it was far too much gun for a battlefield that demanded speed and concealment. The irony was staggering. The Army was building weapons designed for a static, long-range tank duel. Meanwhile, the actual fighting in Europe had demonstrated that anti-tank engagements were sudden, close-range ambushes in dense terrain. As massive experimental guns, many of which never saw mass production, were the final, deafening sound of a doctrine dying in the machine shop. Meanwhile, the statisticians were working. They compiled the hard, cold data, torn from the battlefields of late 1944 and early 1945. Mathematics replaced the visceral fear of the gunner. The figures delivered a final, merciless verdict on the towed concept. A defensive action fought by a self-propelled M10 tank destroyer battalion achieved a success rate of 14 out of 16 actions. A towed 3-inch battalion, facing comparable threats, succeeded in only 2 out of 9 defensive actions. The exchange ratio was the final nail in the coffin. M10s, even without infantry support, achieved a favorable kill ratio of nearly 2 to 1, climbing to a remarkable 6 to 1 when integrated with foot soldiers. The towed guns, by contrast, remained tank fodder. The data confirmed what the gunners had been screaming in the mud for months. Mobility and protection were not battlefield luxuries, they were absolute necessities. The war had taught the U.S. Army that a crew would stand by a weapon if it offered them a fighting chance to live. They would not stay with a gun that offered only a thin shield and a guaranteed death sentence. The sentiment was universal among field commanders. Men cannot and will not stay with towed guns as they will with the M10 or M18. This painful lesson, however, was highly context-dependent. Across the Pacific, the obsolete 37mm gun stubbornly refused to die. In the humid, tangled jungles of Iwo Jima, the tiny M3 gun was not facing the massive sloped armor of a German Panther. Instead, it confronted bunkers, concrete pillboxes, and the thin-skinned, often obsolete tanks of the Imperial Japanese Army. And here, the very qualities that had doomed it in Europe, its lightweight and small profile, suddenly became crucial assets. Marine Corps Corporal Thomas Reed, fighting through the volcanic ash, watched his crew work. They manhandled their 37mm M3, affectionately nicknamed Pee-wee, into position against a deeply dug-in Japanese strongpoint. They had stripped the gun down, and Marine Corps workshops had even welded irregular enlarged shields onto them, based on improvised camouflage suggestions. "Up, up! Get the trail over that log." Reed grunted, pulling on the cold steel. The gun's light weight allowed the Marines to drag it where no jeep, and certainly no massive 57mm or 3-inch gun could ever go. It became a specialized tool for close-in fire support and the destruction of concrete bunkers. The high-explosive rounds, which had been deemed far too small for the armored warfare of Europe, proved devastating against soft targets and reinforced concrete. Reed lined up the tiny sights on the firing slit of the bunker. The M3 spat fire. The shell punched through the concrete lip and detonated inside. The 37mm, a failure against Hitler's steel, was suddenly a deadly, effective infantry support weapon against the Japanese defenses. It was a final, fleeting moment of vindication for a weapon designed so long ago. But even here in the Pacific, the future was already arriving in a tube. The M1 bazooka, a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, had diverted resources and interest away from light-towed guns years earlier. Its success confirmed the inevitable shift toward man-portable, disposable anti-tank solutions. In May of 1946, the Stilwell Board formalized the end of the entire era. The resulting report was dry, bureaucratic, and utterly final. It stated plainly that all further development of towed anti-tank guns must immediately cease. By June of 1945, the official tables of organization and equipment for regimental anti-tank companies had already dropped towed guns entirely. The U.S. Army turned its back completely on the gun and carriage system it had struggled for over a decade to perfect. The legacy of the 37mm, the 57mm, and the 3-inch gun was not one of great victories. It was a legacy of crucial, painful lessons learned at immense cost. The undeniable future lay in self-propelled armor, in the long reach of the recoilless rifle, and eventually in the precision guidance of anti-tank missiles. These were weapons that offered the gunner mobility, protection, and the ability to strike from a distance without exposing himself to the enemy. The age of the brave gunner, standing exposed behind a thin shield and waiting for the inevitable, was officially over. The cost of that bravery had finally been paid in full. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories, and please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.